Hello, everyone. This is a developer interview with Nathanael Weiss, the creator of Songbringer. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and Songbringer.
Oh, sure. I'm a developer here from the West Coast of the United States, and Songbringer is a procedurally generated, almost like a Zelda 1 or early 8-bit style um, action RPG, but with more like 16-bit elements and then newer, more modern art style.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really cool. So, what inspired you to make Songbringer over some other game, over a conventional FPS or a Candy Crush clone?
Well, I had always been very much Zelda was always one of my favorite games
Yeah.
as a kid, and then I played a lot of the Zeldas in my like 20s and things like that, and it really felt to me like the Zelda series was getting, I don't know, more linear, more narrow in the choices that it allowed a player
More
to make.
mainstream almost?
Yeah, more mainstream in a way. Yeah. It's almost like it held your hand a little bit too
Mm,
much, but also it started forcing you to do things.
yeah.
And so I always wanted to create a game sort of in the same structure as a Zelda game, but had way more choice as a player. Like not only just like what worlds you can explore, but also like how you overcome challenges. Like when the game presents you with a challenge, is there more than one way to get past that challenge or to overcome it? And so I wanted to find a way to do that, and so that's how I settled on creating the idea of creating a procedurally generated sort of Zelda game. And it was quite a technical challenge to achieve that, I could tell you.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, tell us a bit more about the procedural aspects of the game, because I'm guessing the entirety of it isn't procedurally generated.
Well, not quite. So it's always the same story.
Hmm.
It's always the same artwork and same biomes and things like that. It's always the same 10 bosses. But what is procedural in Songbringer is that you give it a world seed, and that world seed is like 6 letters, and those 6 letters determine the location of everything in your overworld, the layout of your whole overworld, the layout of all the 10 dungeons, the order of the items, the order of the bosses you get. So it's procedural in that sense, where you can basically play it again and again and surprise yourself with where everything is, the locations of even like the secrets, and also the music is procedural too, just a little bit. So when you go into different dungeons in different world seeds, the melody of the music changes depending on your world seed. So might have a different key in a different world seed, so it might sound a little bit different.
Okay, that sounds really cool. So, is there any variation in with the procedural nature with the enemies? So, are there any enemies that are only available, let's say, on certain seeds, or does the difficulty of the enemies increase on certain seeds, or anything like that?
No, the enemies are all consistent. It's really meant to give you sort of the feeling of a handcrafted, bespoke game, but just the procedural aspect was really just meant to kind of give you that surprise element where everything is now in a new place. You can really it's all about exploration.
Yeah.
That's really the heart of Songbringer is it's all about exploration. You're meant to just go explore, to feel that sense of wanderlust, like to like get excited about where a secret might be and like to get super joyful like whoa, I just found a secret in that place, you know.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really cool. So yeah, regarding the actual game and more specifically the game engine, what engine did you use for the game, and was it the same on all platforms? Because obviously it's available on desktop and on consoles as well.
Right, so I used Cocos 2DX
Mm-hmm.
for the game's development on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And then I throughout the project I did a Kickstarter, and thankfully that succeeded. And then I also got a publisher later on who helped and backed the project. And they're the ones, their name is Double 11. They're an amazing publisher. I've really had a great time working with them. And they're the ones that basically ported the game to consoles. And
Okay.
with consoles, you basically kind of have to rewrite all, you have to use your own engine. So what they did is they basically took portions of Cocos 2DX and just threw away everything they didn't need in Cocos 2DX, and then sort of wrote a an abstraction layer, which basically just mimicked Cocos 2DX, but used their graphics engine and everything underneath it.
Okay.
So
That sounds
yeah,
cool.
that was necessary to get it on
So,
consoles because
so
every console has its own SDK.
yeah. So how much like technical involvement did you have on the console? Because like you said on on the desktop platforms you use Cocos and you obviously coded that on there, but it was ported over. But I'm interested in how much technical involvement did you have with Double 11?
Well, we worked really closely. We had like an SVN going where I would submit code and they would submit fixes too. So we worked pretty closely, but mostly the technical aspect of working on consoles was done by Double 11.
Okay.
I just basically was responsible mostly for the game code. It's about 100,000 lines of game code, and that was kind of my responsibility. Their responsibility was more about getting it to technically work on consoles, fixing any bugs on the consoles, and things like that.
Okay. So yeah, that sounds really cool. So regarding the game itself, what's your favorite part of the game? What's the part that you're most proud of?
Well, I'm quite proud that I can play a game with that full sense of story and and have it be different every time. Like it's so satisfying as a developer to like enter in a different world seed and play something totally new. Like it made the whole development of the project really easy because I have to play it all the time. Like I play this game once a day, and to have it be different every time is a really refreshing thing.
Yeah, I can imagine because as a game developer myself, having to play the same game over and over again, even though you love the game, having to do like even something as mundane as just going through the menus. I'm sure you can attest to that. It just becomes almost like a chore. But you're
Yeah.
saying with Songbringer because you can randomly generate, and that's obviously part of the testing process. It does add a bit of variety with the game. So regarding
Yes.
the just circling back to the porting side again, how late or early in the development did that start? Because obviously, if let's say you're a team and you're working together on one single, let's say, engine, Unreal or Unity, that's a little different. But if you're making the, let's say, the desktop version, and if maybe you make some really big change which requires quite a lot of rewriting, how do you handle something like that with Double 11? Because obviously I'm guessing from their perspective the last thing they want to have to do is implement a feature that takes, I don't know, 2 weeks, and then you come and say, oh, I've scrapped that feature, I've got this whole other new one, and you'll have to start again.
Right. Yeah, it was so the game's been in development for about 3 years, and it's really only this last year where Double 11 and I really started working together closely. We had an arrangement for a while. It's just that we knew that we wanted to start the whole merging of our code and the development together at a point where the game was pretty mature technically. Like
Mm-hmm.
most. So by that time, most of the game systems were all complete. Most of the game itself was complete. There was really only like the final boss and like maybe a final dungeon and things like that were left to do. So really, it was a pretty good time for us to do that. Had we done it any earlier, it would have been a lot more difficult because there would have been those kind of changes you were just mentioning where it would have been deep things with different systems and stuff like that would have probably caused problems with that. So yeah, it was good to do it towards the end of the project.
Okay, yeah. I can imagine. So, regarding the testing, because obviously you tested the desktop version, how did the testing go for testing the console versions? Was that tested on like a daily basis, or was it once they had a new stable build ready? And also, how about vice versa as well? Did they test the desktop version as well to see, oh, will this even work well on a console? Because obviously a console has a controller and certain things don't quite work as well with a keyboard and vice versa.
Yeah, so they Double Eleven is amazing because they have their own internal QA team, and so they played the game daily. And not only did they play it on consoles, but they also played my Steam version too. So they were able to really provide some comprehensive feedback all the time, finding great bugs, like providing feedback even on like design elements and things like that. So it was really helpful to have them testing the game all the time. And then also I have my own personal QA system where I basically will do a bunch of work, usually for about a week long, and then I'll go and and then play it myself. And I try and like really relax. I do meditation a lot, so frequently I'll meditate before that to just completely clear my mind and try and put myself in the shoes of someone that's brand new to Songbringer. And it really helped having the world seeds being able to be procedural in
Yeah.
that sense too. But yeah, it's like so in that sense, I would always like go through the game, play it for all the way through. Like lately, I've been doing speed runs of it, so I can actually complete the whole game in about an hour and a half, where it's really like an 8 to 10 hour experience for
Yeah.
most people on their first experience of it. But that allows me to go through the whole game and really see that everything is still in its place and everything's still working, and I can experience all those aspects. And for the longest time, I would add 20 to 30 different things on my list to do from just one playthrough. So it was like a lot of personal feedback that I would get, and then later I would go back and work on that item and that item and that item, and just and that's how it got developed. It was a really iterative process of playing the game, giving some feedback, taking feedback from other players and Double Eleven's QA team, and making the game better and better and better.
Okay. That sounds fantastic. So, regarding, if any, cross platform features and any plans for any cross platform aspects.
Yeah, and what about that?
Oh, do you have any plans for any sort of cross-platform aspects, whether it's leaderboards or eventually whether it's some sort of multiplayer or sharing of seeds cross-platform, like for let's say from PlayStation to PC and vice versa?
Oh, well, no, we didn't actually ever get to do that. Your save game can be shared at least on the Steam version.
Yeah.
Your save game is cross-platform, so you got Windows, Mac, and Linux. You could play your save on any one of those platforms and share your save across those. But as far as like leaderboards being shared between all those platforms, it's kind of like PlayStation has their own
Yeah.
leaderboard, Xbox has their own leaderboard, Steam has their own leaderboard, GOG has their own leaderboard. Everybody wants their own leaderboard, and
Yeah.
they don't want you to use somebody else's leaderboard. So you kind of have to do it that way.
Yeah, they all sort of want to become the dominant platform. They don't want to succumb to anyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had to create the game all over again, knowing what you know now, going through all the experiences over the last 3, possibly plus years, what would you do different, and what would you do the same?
Oh well, I'll start with what I would do the same. Um, I started this whole project with this thought, and I got to provide a little bit of context to this because I was in a rough place in life. I had spent all my money. I had ran up all this credit card debt making my last video game, and it was basically a failure, a complete flop because um, no marketing was done. So I learned my lesson pretty hard that you got to do your own marketing from day one. If you're an indie, you've got to be marketing from the very first day you develop, like sharing tweets on Twitter at least, or doing like the videos. Like that's how I settled on doing the live streams. That I would do like 5 days a week. Sometimes I'd be doing, an hour or two a day of live video, sharing code with people live, sharing the artwork live, sharing the music live, and just connecting with people and sort of building a following for the game along the way. And that's kind of what made Songbringer succeed. But going back to that moment of creation, I asked myself this question, and it was only because I was in such a hard place in life that I really got to this point where I genuinely had to ask this question: was what would I create if this was the last thing I could ever create in my life? And honestly, I had considered an album. I'm also a musician, so I was
Okay.
thinking maybe I'll make an album. But I settled on a video game because it incorporates so many different mediums into one. You got programming and art and music. And as a creator, as a developer, I can express myself in so many different ways. So I'm really glad I chose the video game. And since it was coming from that question of what would I create for the last thing I ever created, it made it into this incredible passion project and made every minute of its development a joy. And so that's what I would do the same for everything I ever create for the rest of my life. I'll ask myself that question. Um, and what would I do differently? I guess there's one thing that I've learned from launching it recently, and that's that no matter how much personal QA or in-house QA you do, or even beta testing with a crowd of people that are already sort of used to your game, you've really still got to go and try and find feedback from the real, honest players. Because there were a couple issues with Songbringer at the game's launch, where basically there was this hitbox issue that no one had really mentioned during the beta, because I think most people were already used to it. They were used to the game as it was, and no one ever really commented because it didn't really feel bad to them. But when it came in the hands of real players and players that are willing to just be mean, you know what I mean? There's
Yeah.
Players can be mean sometimes, and it's not that they actually do hate your creation or whatever. I think that's when they are mean, they sometimes are just trying to actually help in a
Yeah.
way. And I really feel like if there was some kind of service where you could hire some mean players
Yeah.
to play your game and give you some honest feedback on it, it would really help, because you could catch issues that might be things that give you a slightly worse Metacritic score. For example, I really feel like Songbringer deserved like a maybe like an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 from most reviews, but it got more like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, just because there were these few little issues which could have been solved quite easily from before they reviewed it, if I had just had a little bit more raw, honest, and actually just maybe more mean feedback. So, and luckily, that stuff has already been fixed and stuff like that. So now it's all good. I just kind of wish we would have had that beforehand.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that sounds fantastic. So, regarding the art aspect, because from what I gather, you created the art yourself as well. Tell us a little bit about that process. So was you a programmer first, an artist first, or neither? And is any of the art procedural? If not, do you plan on ever making any of the art procedural?
So I have been a programmer for over 20 years. I started programming when I was 15 in high school, and I started learning to program basically in order to make my own video games. It was kind of a dream of mine since I started playing video games when I was a younger child, and I had just got interested in it in high school and started learning. I learned the C programming language. I wrote games in DOS. Um, this was back in like 1995. And so I've been a programmer for a long, long time. And my first games didn't really do that well. And I had actually done the artwork myself. It was some pixel art and stuff like that. So since the games didn't really do that well, I started losing faith in my own creative skills. I thought, oh, I'll never be an artist. I'll never be a musician. But at least I'm a programmer and I can hire out some art, hire out some music, and in that sense, I can still make games. Um, and then I went through a phase where I learned to make music, and I actually stopped programming for a long time. And then later on, I finally got back into programming and thought, wouldn't it be so cool if I could learn to make art? Then I would have all the skills I needed to make my own games entirely. And that happened just about 3 or 4 years ago, about a year or two before I started Songbringer. I started learning to make pixel art, and and this time I got better at it, and I got more confident in my skills. And it took time. It took time to get used to the graphics tablet, and it took time to get all the skills of an artist, but it really wasn't that difficult. And yeah, it was just a process of just sort of believing in myself. And as far as the art being procedural, there's one thing that is procedural in the art, and that is the ground textures. So when you're looking at the ground textures in Songbringer, there's this sort of there's a lot of different patterns, and there's noise and things like that going on to create these ground textures. So that's the only bit of the art that's procedural. But in future games, I might experiment with some more procedurally generated art.
Okay. So regarding the ground stuff, the textures, is that sort of procedural? Is that fully procedural? So you're just drawing colors and shapes, or do you have essentially like a list of different textures and you join them up?
Oh no, it's fully procedural. Yeah, so it basically, to get technical, it just creates a render texture.
Yeah.
Or actually before that, it creates some memory, and then basically just it blits in all the colors that it's going to use. So it starts with an overall color and throws that down, and then it throws on some noise to give it some texture, and then after that it adds sort of a vignette effect, or I don't know how you say that word actually, but sort of a like a it's dark, it's like a oval shaped shadow almost, where it's darker on the edges and lighter in the middle.
Okay. Yeah.
And then it adds some of these little shapes, which are just sort of generated randomly. Um, and then after that, it's kind of mostly done. And then it's got a texture for the ground.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds awesome. So, is there any sort of rule engine that you've applied to it, or is it just a free for all and you can get whatever color, whatever shapes on the ground?
Right. So there's a rule engine, and then there's also a procedural part of it too. So the rule engine is basically some data, and I've created these data files basically that says, okay, I want the ground texture to be these dimensions. I want it to have this much percentage of noise. I want it to have this much percentage of shading and stuff like that. So there's basically some factors or some properties that are loaded from a data file, and those are used to generate the texture. So those are kind of the rules. And then the procedural part is that it uses your world seed to generate all that noise and the placement of all the little shapes and things like that, so that it comes out exactly the same every time, no matter where you are in the world. So if you start on the home screen, it will always be exactly the same ground texture on the home screen of a certain world seed, and same for every other room.
Okay. That sounds awesome. So, regarding the code, because you've been showing a lot of it on YouTube and via your Twitch streams as well, do you plan on open sourcing the game at all in the future, or maybe open sourcing certain snippets or algorithms that you've developed, or even making some of the artwork royalty free?
I have already made two things, actually three parts of it, open source.
Okay.
And so that is the entity component system I use to create Songbringer. I made that open source. It's called Entity Fu, like FU, like Kung Fu.
Yeah.
And it's on GitHub. And then
Okay.
also I made the data file format I use to create Songbringer is a really simple thing. It's even more simple than JSON and less characters than JSON. And I called that Valtree, and that's also on GitHub. And then also I used a tool called Rapid Game, which I created well before Songbringer. which basically just pre-compiles Cocos 2DX into some libraries, and then you can use that to build your game faster without having to rebuild Cocos 2DX
Yeah,
at all.
I remember Rapid Game. I remember looking at. I think you created a video regarding it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember watching that video a while ago because I'm a Cocos developer as well, and I provide a lot of tutorials to the Cocos community. So I remember coming across that when I was just doing some research into Cocos and just looking for resources of my own to actually learn from. So yeah, that sounds fantastic. And for all the listeners that are interested in accessing them, there'll be links in the description to that, and obviously a link to the Songbringer Steam page and homepage as well. So regarding languages, what's your favorite language? Whether or not that's the same as the language you use to develop Songbringer.
well, I wouldn't say it's my favorite language because I'm actually really excited right now. To tell you the truth, I'm most excited about Jai,
Okay.
the language that Jonathan Blow is creating. I can't wait for that to come out, and I will definitely write my games in that language from the moment he finally releases it. But I've always been a C and C++ developer, and so I that's my workhorse language. I guess in that sense I love C++, and but actually I'm considering since Jai probably won't come out soon. I'm actually considering rewriting, portions of the code that I wrote for Songbringer in C,
Okay.
because I'm tired of how slowly C++ compiles. It's just really painful to have to wait for, even have to wait like 5 or 10 seconds to recompile one file is just too long to me anymore.
Yeah,
And
I know what you
so,
mean.
yeah.
So yeah, have you ever thought about creating a custom game engine instead of using Cocos 2DX, having your own one and maybe even eventually making it cross-platform?
Yeah, I have actually. I don't know whether I will or not, because I really want to focus mostly on making games at this point in my life. And I know that if I stop and make a game engine, I'll have spent enough time that I could have made a whole game.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a trade off. What I actually might do is create sort of an engine abstraction layer where I'm kind of like able to use I could throw in SDL or Cocos 2DX and still be using my own abstraction layer without really having to know anything about Cocos 2DX or SDL or whatever.
Yeah, I think something like that for any sort of developer is immensely useful because I'm also a university lecturer and I teach computer games programming, and that's one of the things that we try and instill into the students, that try and abstract it as much as possible. So if you're looking at a game file, for example, it really shouldn't have any mention or have any. You shouldn't have any idea of what engine it's using. You should just be able to call a method like draw sprite, for example, or play audio, and it should just
Yeah,
do it the way a cross-platform framework does it anyway. So they do it already. So why did you
yeah, yeah.
choose Cocos over Unity or Unreal or anything else, and why Cocos C++ over the JavaScript or even the Lua binaries?
Well, first of all, I was already familiar with it, but most importantly, it was C++ and fully open source. When I started Songbringer, Unity had not yet open sourced their engine. I'm not sure I don't even know how open source it really is now or what, but also another huge part of it is that Unity and Unreal and all that, they are software,
Yeah.
and you have to run the software and use it to create your game. But I am much more of the kind of person that prefers to have access to all of the source code and be able to, and especially to not have to use software to make my game. I want to be able to just compile it from the command line in Vim and run it from Vim right there. And I mostly develop on a Mac. I do use Windows too and Linux, but On Mac, I have Xcode, but I only use it for debugging. It's a really great debugger. I love Xcode for that. But today, I mostly develop in Vim in my own kind of custom environment, which I find is much faster than developing in Xcode or any sort of UI or piece of software.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. So, will there be a Songbringer 2? And are you working on any projects that you can talk about now, or any major updates to Songbringer?
Yeah, so yes, there's definitely plans for Songbringer 2. But at this point, I'm still working on Songbringer. So there's
Yeah,
going to be some updates planned, some cool new items that are going to be added to the game. A new sort of, there'll be like at least one new boss and things like that. So there'll be some fun stuff coming for Songbringer still.
that sounds awesome. So, it's on PC, PC meaning just like desktop in general. It's on PlayStation and Xbox. Do you have any plans to porting it to the Nintendo Switch? Because the games that I played on the Switch, excluding Mario Kart and Zelda, they do seem very indie heavy, and I can imagine a game like this would be fantastic on the Switch. And do you have any plans on porting it to mobile?
As far as Nintendo Switch goes, it's something we're sort of looking into. I have no solid info on that yet, so I can't really say yes or no or even maybe at this point. But and as far as iOS goes, yeah, that was promised during the Kickstarter. So it's something where I basically have got to let this sort of settle, and then basically port it to iOS as well.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. So, if you're porting it to iOS, could we see a Android port as well in the future? Because Codecast 2DX is cross-platform.
Possibly. It kind of depends on like how much work it's going to
Yeah.
be and how much interest there really is for it.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. So, what advice would you give to other indie developers, whether they've just got an idea, so they're just at the seed stage, or they've launched the game?
Well, those are two different situations. If you're in the idea phase of game development, um, this is what I see happen most of the time. Is most developers these days, it seems like I'm not trying to like point any fingers or anything like that, but what happens is a lot of people will have an idea, they'll get really excited about it, they'll work hard on it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a month, and then they give up on it, or
Yeah,
they try something else, or they there's a lot of sort of that going on,
yeah,
and that's why I would encourage people to really focus on what it is they really really want to create. You know what I mean? Like, and just get really genuine and honest about what it is that you really most desire to create, what you want to see in a game, so that you find an idea that you want to stick with.
yeah. Okay. So, how about to some? What advice would you give to somebody that's nearing the end of development, or they've even launched?
Well, if you're nearing the end of development, I guess my biggest piece of advice would be to try and take care of yourself.
Yeah,
Because at the end of a game, it's always the hardest time, so stressful, tons of bugs, the feeling of nervousness coming up to launch and like what's going to happen. Is the game going to do well? Am I, is it not going to do well? You're afraid of future. You're excited for the future. Things like that. Just take the time to care for yourself. Like, give yourself the time off that you need. Do whatever it is that makes you feel relaxed, and focus on the things that are important to you outside of game development, because you never know when those things might just be gone the next
yeah.
day. So,
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. So, yeah, this has been a fantastic developer interview with Nathanael Weiss. Do you have any closing comments for the listeners out there?
Yeah, I guess my only closing comment is to just look your dreams in the eye. You know what I mean? Be honest with yourself about what you want to do, and and that's it.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. So, yeah, like I was saying, this has just been a fantastic interview with Nathanael Weiss, the creator of Songbringer. I'd like to thank him for taking the time out to talk to me and to present all of this information to the listeners out there. And a sort of indirect thank you to Double 11 as well for helping you get this game to console. Because I've played it on I've only played the Steam version, but I do plan on purchasing the PlayStation 4 version as well because I want to see how they compare. Because as a developer, that's the sort of stuff that I always look at, how different platforms do compare with each other. So regarding closing comments from me, one thing I really want to say that I liked about the game, actually there's a bunch of things, obviously the procedural nature of the game, the art and the animation I loved, but something I really liked was it was before you even start playing, it's where it asks for input on the PC version. Because when you first launch it, if you haven't played it, it checks if you've got a controller connected. At the time, I didn't have my Xbox controller connected, or I played it since with a Xbox One controller. But what it does is it displays like an old school controller on the screen, and it sort of highlights certain buttons on there, sort of buttons that you're familiar with on controllers, and then it asks you to press a key on your keyboard that you would like to assign to that particular button. And I thought that was just fantastic because I've seen elements like that where they at the start ask you for some sort of input on what you would like, well, your input to be, but on that level where you could see a controller, see exactly what button they're asking, because sometimes when it's written in text you don't always understand exactly what button that will map to, but when you see a controller and it's, oh, it's the d-pad or it's one of the face buttons or it's the start and select button, you can immediately see, okay, I want this button assigned to that one, or I want this button assigned to that. So I thought that was, even though that's probably not a feature that most people will talk about, I thought that was a fantastic little feature. It showed that not only that you took care in creating the game itself, the actual gameplay, but you also spent some time, you actually put a lot of love into the main menu as well, because that's always something that a lot of developers, especially near in the end, will end up sort of falling down on, letting certain things slide just because they've done the game, they're tired, and they don't want to essentially, I want to say not want to put the work in, but at that moment when they're tired, they can't immediately see the importance of that. So yeah, for me, that was one of the highlights of the game. It was actually the custom input. So yeah, thank you, Nathaniel. This has been Farhan Hussain of Sonar Systems, developer interview with Nathaniel Weiss of Songbringer. Is there anything else you want to say just before we wrap up?
No, thanks for Han. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's it. So thank you very much, Nathaniel.